the world once again sat in Paris, France, to give birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It can't be argued that human rights have injected some kind of decency into human affairs, but that too has had its ups and downs. Once again, a year later in 1949, in Geneva, Switzerland, the world sat down to bring into being what is called the law of war, to ensure that even in circumstances where war breaks out, it is prosecuted in a manner that is respectful of human beings and human affairs. But today, we find ourselves in a situation where the world is grappling with many issues which have affected peace. Conflict. In Europe, we have seen the breakup of the Soviet Union and the wars that took place thereafter. We saw the Spanish Civil War. In Asia, we saw the wars that took place in India immediately after independence between India and Pakistan. And in 1971, the war between Pakistan and Bangladesh. We have seen the Korean Wars of 1953. In the continent of Africa, we have also seen many wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in the Cameroons, in Central African Republic, in Libya, in Sudan, and we have, of course, seen wars being conducted in Latin America. In a nutshell, the world has seen many conflicts which have given birth to human suffering on a scale that was unprecedented, which then begs the question, how is the world going to immunize ourselves against war? The question that must be asked, is the United Nations capable of ensuring that we do not have war? Continentally, is the African Union capable of ensuring that we do not have war? And the answer is that we find ourselves in a very sorry situation. And the net effect of these is that we are seeing human suffering in proportions that were not contemplated at any one time, with refugees moving within continent, within Europe, within Africa, within Latin America, within Asia. We are seeing hunger in different parts of the world, and this is undermining development, with the consequences that the promises we made to ourselves and that we have made to ourselves continentally within the continent of Africa and globally under the aegis of the United Nations, those promises are not being met. We will, for example, remember that we had the Millennium Development Goals. Most of them were not realized. We now have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and in many parts of the world, those are not being realized. In the continent of Africa, we have Africa Agenda 2063, and we are talking about Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But these are being undermined because of the headwinds that we are seeing in the conflict that have been generated. Today, a most unexpected conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Many commentators thought that it would be a short conflict, but 1 year down the line, the conflict continues, and it has affected the distribution of grain throughout the world. Many did not know that Ukraine was responsible for the production of grain in the manner that we now know. And it's not only grain that we are talking about. It has affected the supply of gas to Europe. It has affected the supply of petroleum to the rest of the world. And that has indeed undermined production and increased the cost of living. So that when we talk about the cost of living now, in the first quarter of the 21st century, it is a combination of factors which in itself is leading to a situation that is causing and creating an environment that breeds conflict, and conflict is continuing apace. In the continent of Africa, for example, in the year 2021, the African Union said that in order to grow, Africa must silence the guns. We thought we would, but we now know that it is not as easy as we thought it would be. And many young men and women in the continent of Africa are being victimized. Organizations are being formed which are breeding ground for mercenaries in the Sahelian region. We hear of Boko Haram, we hear of Al-Shabaab, and all these bodies. When you go to the Arab world, you hear of bodies such as Al-Qaeda, which have been operating in countries such as Iraq and in Afghanistan. We hear of the Taliban, and all these are armies that do not respond to a single chain of command. So that one can easily say that there is chaos in the world. Look at what is happening in Haiti, for example. Haiti has now become a haven for warlords, and it is an environment that is toxic, in an environment that is damaging to the futures of and livelihoods of young men and women, and the situation is dire. So in a nutshell, the world finds herself in a situation which she did not contemplate, particularly when we are talking about the 21st century, when we are also talking about the 4th industrial revolution and the 5th industrial revolution. It beggars belief that in an environment of profound enlightenment, we find ourselves in the most astounding primitivity of man's inhumanity to man. You know, throughout the ages, young people have always been the fuel that lit the fire of change. If you go down in history and you looked at all civilizations, whether it is in Europe of old, it is young people who rose. We remember in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, and even prior to that, in places such as the Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Revolution, it was young people who are the drivers. If you look at the United States of America, which is part of the so-called New World, it was young people who are in the forefront of the change that took place, both in the struggle for independence and the civil rights movement, with people like Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr., John Henry Clark, W.B. Du Bois. If you look at the Caribbean, it's people like Sylvester Williams and individuals such as Marcus Garvey who are pushing the Pan-African movement. And if you come to Latin America, you will find that it was younger people, people like Simon Bolivar, who was responsible for the changes that took place in Latin America, creating in Argentina, in Bolivia, young people. If you come to Asia, once again, it was young people. If you talk about the changes that took place in that part of the world, it was individuals such as Chairman Mao Zedong when they were younger. In India, it was younger people such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, who are responsible, and much later people like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh. In the continent of Africa, if you look at the younger people who are involved in the struggle for independence, Kwame Nkrumah, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Modibo Keita, Ahmed Ben Bella, Samora Moises Machel, Agostino Neto, you can count many of them. And critically, you see that in any country, we now talk, for example, of the Young Turks. Many people forget that it was in those days of Atatürk of Turkey that the Young Turks emerged and created what we now know as modern Turkey. In China, in Tiananmen Square, in Korea, the 1980s changes, in South Africa, the independence movement I've already talked about, but go to South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre, Go to that same South Africa, the Soweto rebellions and all these. So young people have to recognize, particularly young people in the continent of Africa now, that if Africa is to know change, and this is not only applicable to young Africans, it's applicable to young Europeans, it is applicable to young Asians. It is the synergy that will be created amongst young people, the cohabitation of well-meaning efforts by young people that is going to change the world. And the world must change. Nobody is going to live in silos. The octogenarian politicians that we now have who are ruling the roost, the only way that we are going to remove them is by creating a network of young people throughout the world who are not going to be persuaded to do the right things out of racism, creed, religion, or ethnicity. And it can be done. The spirit that led to the creation of the United Nations in 1945 was a defying spirit. The spirit that led to the creation of the non-aligned movement when people in Yugoslavia such as Josip Broz Tito, Jawaharlal Nehru in India, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in the Arab world, and Kwame Nkrumah in Africa, when they met, they only said that there was one humanity. And I remember Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe saying in 1960, there is only one race, the human race. And that to me is what the younger people ought to be talking about going forward. Because if they take that path, then we can meaningfully expect that the wars we have, which are affecting the entire world, will then be a thing of the past. Today, nobody can afford to live in silos. And if you ever doubted that reality, see what happened with COVID. When it started in China, we thought that it would not go to the rest of the world, but it did. And who are responsible for it? Young people. Young people. And that's why I agree with Mwalimu Julius Nyerere when he said in 1967, the secret to development is having young men and women who are well brought up, young men and women who have vision, young men and women who are prepared to sacrifice to ensure that they create a sustainable environment for their generation and generations yet to be born. You know, I'm speaking at a time when the world is under no illusions. If anybody thought that the war in Ukraine was too remote, too alien, they now know better. They now know that the bread that is eaten in Egypt, they now know that the bread that is eaten in Garowe in Somalia, that the bread that is eaten in Nairobi, Kenya, is made out of grain from Ukraine. And that therefore you cannot ignore that war. We now know that when Russia and Ukraine are fighting, then it will affect the cost of fuel. And if it affects the cost of fuel, then it will affect the cost of commodities which we use on a daily basis. We now know that it will affect the world's supply chain, and the things that we take for granted will be disrupted. Therefore, we have a keen interest, and Africa must have a keen interest, and it gladdens my heart that the African Union has now decided to send a peace delegation to Moscow and to Kiev to talk to the leaders of the combating parties to bring peace. And I hope that Africa will begin to rise as a continent that can midwife peace, because peace is critical to African development in all its aspects, and history has demonstrated not once, not twice, but times without number, that indeed the world is but a global village, and a war in what you think is geographically a distant land affects you in a very practical and real-time way. I've always held the view that when a house is on fire, you put out the fire. You don't try to determine who lit the fire in the first place. And we find ourselves in such a situation. And the question as to who is right and who is wrong depends on who you are talking to. If you talk to the Western world and the Ukrainians, they hold the view that Russia is the aggressor. And they are therefore actually fighting this war. The reality of this war is that Russia is fighting the entire Western world. That is the reality. Many African countries quietly actually support Russia. And they support Russia out of historical reasons. That at critical moments during the struggle for independence, it is the Russians who came out to support those who are fighting for independence. The Russians who are present in Congo, the Russians who are present during the struggle in South Africa, the Russians who are present in Mozambique, the Russians who are present in Angola, the Russians who are present in Guinea-Bissau, and therefore sentimentally, Africans support Russia. But no matter who we support, my own view is that war has no eyes. The net effect is that those who are not responsible for the war end up suffering. And I hope that this war, once it's settled, will send a clear message also to the Western world that their hegemonic approach to world affairs must come to an end, and that the era of unilateralism and manipulation of multilateral institutions must stop, and the approach to world affairs must be collegiate through the UN. If they don't do that, then the Western world will find itself in a very difficult position, and the only thing that will protect them from the rest of the world is that they have nuclear weapons which they can unleash upon the rest of the world. And the writing is on the wall. If you look at the world today, and the dollar has been the dominant currency in the world. And the dollar's dominance came about in the 1960s, 1970s, perhaps a little earlier. But the dollar became the hegemonic currency when they entered into an arrangement with the Saudis, and we then gave the world, or they gave the world, the term petrodollar. So that what then started happening is that the dollar was no longer backed by any gold. The dollar became a fiat currency during the Nixonian era. Oh, I'm saying era and era at the same time. It was an era and an era at the same time. And almost all transactions in the world are terminated in the dollar. And they have used the dollar as an instrument of political and economic control, and that is coupled with the use of institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And you remember, the World Bank and the IMF were created in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States in 1944 by American economists and British economists at that time, as a way of finding funds and deploying funds for the rebuilding of Europe after the World War II. But when African countries became independent, we also found ourselves in that space. So when you hear people saying we want to de-dollarize, they are actually saying we want total independence. And total independence means economic emancipation. People are saying we have been manipulated for too long. We've been controlled for too long. The Americans can print dollars and deploy them anywhere in the world. And it is suggested that nearly 40% of the American dollars is actually circulating outside of the United States of America. So that even when America says that they are the most heavily indebted nation on earth, they are not. In fact, they can just print dollars and pay their debts. So this is a cry by the world that we want change, that freedom must mean that we are capable of trading at levels which are equal, that we can run our affairs without being dictated to. As I speak to you now, if you are in Nouakchott in Mauritania and you want to send money to somebody in Abidjan in La Côte d'Ivoire, the correspondent bank will be in the United States of America or in Paris. How can that be allowed to happen? And then we talk about the sovereignty of the nation. I hear that cry, and I too am a warrior in that struggle. The warrior to de-dollarize and have a completely reconfigured architecture of the world economy. And that is why BRICS, which is now bringing together new countries that are emerging out of the domination of the United States of America, is beginning to make sense. China is in that arrangement. India is in that arrangement. Brazil is in that arrangement. Russia is in that arrangement. South Africa is in that arrangement. And let me tell you, in the next few years, you will see many countries coming into that arrangement with the sole purpose of ensuring that their economies are de-dollarized. And I want to say, part of the reason why you see our economies cannot grow as well and as robustly as they should is because they are shadow economies being controlled like marionettes from Washington, London, Paris, Brussels, and those Western countries. The conflicts that we see, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war, if not stopped, has the potential of spreading to the rest of the world. Remember that the combatants in this particular war are Western European countries and Russia. And all these countries have military bases in the continent of Africa. And if one mistake is made and it degenerates into a nuclear war, nobody will be spared. And indeed, that is the reason why the African Union and African leaders have now said we can no longer afford the luxury of sitting back. We must come into the forefront and send a peace mission. They realize, as we say in Kiswahili, if your neighbor is having a haircut, you must also take water and put it on your hair, because it is your hair that is next online. And I hope that the African initiative will succeed, because if it does, it will do a number of things. One, it will, number one, demonstrate that Africa is capable of midwifing peace processes. Number two, it will be a message to the Western world that they can no longer dictate to the world what the world needs to do. Number three, it will force the international community through the agency of the United Nations Organization to renegotiate the character and composition of critical institutions of the UN going forward. Also, as it is now, the UN is a body that functions at the behest of the Western world, and others are mere participants playing what sometimes in English may be called the gooseberry, as an unwanted third parties in the entire arrangement. That is why you see international institutions such as the ICC, institutions that sometimes are deployed to deal with those whom America or the British or Europe do not like to operate in a particular way. So I look forward to the quick end of this war, that we start a healing period which is defined by rapprochement.
The informative information presented in this video is motivational and is positively aimed at inspiring, educating and entertaining the viewers with the cutting edge of critical reasoning. If you enjoy the contents on the Black Radar YouTube channel, please consider subscribing to show your support.
This is Mutabaruka. We want to present to you a wholesome kind of level of consciousness right now. So subscribe and tell your friend them. This is Mutabaruka.